Every street you walk and every building you see was designed to control you. Ancient rulers mastered the art of architectural psychology, using structures as tools to dominate the human mind. This exploration reveals the hidden world of the architect kings, showing you how to spot the invisible hand of power in stone and space. You will gain the ability to see through the silent language of buildings and understand the psychological forces that have shaped civilizations. How did a simple doorway become a weapon of submission? And why do certain spaces make us feel small and obedient without a word being spoken? What monumental structure in your own city makes you feel a certain way? And have you ever wondered why the doorway to your own home is a perfect place to start? Think about its height and width. Is it just large enough for you to pass through comfortably, or does it force a slight bow of your head? This is no accident. Ancient architects were masters of such subtle cues, and their earliest experiments in Mesopotamia and Egypt reveal a deep, intuitive grasp of the human mind. They did not have the language of neuroscience, but they meticulously observed how a person felt standing before a colossal temple wall compared to a low, humble dwelling. They saw that towering structures could fill a heart with awe, while narrow, confined corridors could trigger a primal sense of unease or submission. This raw understanding of our psychological responses to space became the bedrock of architectural psychology, the deliberate use of design to shape human behavior and thought. In the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia, the great ziggurats rose towards the heavens. Their design was a masterclass in psychological influence. These stepped pyramids were not just physical stairways for priests, they were psychological ramps for the masses. The relentless repetition of identical tiers, the rhythmic climb up countless steps, was engineered to induce a trance-like meditative state in the worshipper. A mind lulled by such repetition, exhausted from the ascent, becomes far more open and receptive to the doctrines being proclaimed at the summit. It was a form of soft control built right into the bricks. Meanwhile, in Egypt, the pharaohs perfected a different tactic, the psychology of sheer visual dominance. The facade of a royal palace or a temple was not merely a wall, it was a statement carved in stone. Its immense, unbroken scale was meant to be visually overwhelming, communicating an authority so vast and permanent that questioning it seemed as futile as challenging the desert sun. These were not just buildings, they were silent proclamations of power, using precise symmetry, overwhelming mass, and strategic orientation to reinforce a rigid social hierarchy. The common person was meant to feel small, and the ruler was meant to feel like a god. These foundational techniques established architecture not just as shelter, but as a primary medium for psychological manipulation. When you understand that a simple choice like a ceiling height or a hallway's width can carry such profound weight, you begin to see the invisible hand of the architect king in every stone. That feeling of insignificance before a giant pyramid was no accident. It was a calculated psychological strategy. Monumental scale was the architect king's primary tool for generating awe, an emotion that effectively shuts down critical thought and opens the mind to submission. When you stand before the Great Pyramid of Giza, your brain is processing something so far beyond human proportion that it triggers a deep-seated response. This feeling of awe makes you feel small, and in that smallness, the power of the pharaoh feels immense and unassailable. He was not just a man, he was the force that could command such a mountain of stone. This principle was not confined to Egypt. The Roman Colosseum could hold 50,000 roaring spectators. Its sheer, staggering size was a constant, undeniable reminder of the empire's vast resources and its absolute control over the masses gathered within its walls. In Persia, the approach to the royal audience hall at Persepolis was a masterstroke of psychological design. Visitors did not simply walk to the king. They ascended massive, ceremonial staircases and passed through towering gateways guarded by colossal stone beasts. This entire journey was a physical and mental climb, forcing every ambassador and dignitary to literally look upward, their gaze inevitably drawn to the elevated figure of the king. With every step, his supreme status was reinforced before a single word was spoken. Modern psychology confirms this ancient intuition, identifying a specific state called diminishment. It is that exact sensation of being physically and psychologically reduced in the presence of something vastly greater than yourself. By deliberately crafting these overwhelming spaces, rulers from every corner of the ancient world spoke a universal language of dominance. They prepared the human mind for obedience not through threats, but through sheer, breathtaking scale. Yet, what happens when this strategy of the gigantic is inverted, when power chooses to compress space rather than expand it? The opposite of that overwhelming scale is a pathway so carefully designed it feels like a trap for the mind itself. If colossal monuments made you feel small, then the journey towards power was engineered to make you feel compliant. Ancient rulers mastered the art of the strategic pathway, turning simple movement into a form of psychological conditioning. Your walk was no longer your own, it was a choreographed emotional journey. In Athens, the approach to the Parthenon was a masterpiece of this control. You did not march directly to the temple, you followed a winding, ascending path around the Acropolis. With every turn, the magnificent structure would reveal itself in fragments, a column here, a pediment there, building a slow, inexorable sense of anticipation and reverence. The architects were manipulating your perception through a technique known as sequential revelation, strategically disclosing the view to create narrative tension. You were not just walking to a building, you were being led through a story where the grand finale was always the power of the state. On the other side of the world, Imperial China perfected this principle into an art form. The Forbidden City was not a single palace, but a vast series of gates, bridges, and vast courtyards. To reach the emperor, you passed through layer after layer of these spaces. Each massive gate you crossed, each expansive courtyard you traversed, acted as a psychological filter. The chaos and noise of the outside world were systematically stripped away, replaced by an escalating silence and order that demanded your submission. Every threshold was a test of your worthiness, a ritual of purification that prepared you to stand in the presence of the Son of Heaven. This was control through movement, a physical progression that mirrored the mental journey from individual to subject. Even the ancient Maya understood this profound connection. They built long, raised ceremonial causeways known as sakbyab that cut straight through the jungle. These were not just roads, they were sacred pathways. Processions were forced to follow these precise routes, which were often aligned with the movements of the sun, moon, and stars. By linking the ruler's political authority directly to the cosmic order, the Maya ensured that every step a person took towards the center of power was a step that reaffirmed their place in a universe governed by divine kings. In every case, the goal was the same: to dictate the pace and perspective of your approach, ensuring you arrived not as a free-thinking individual, but as a reverent and obedient participant in the ruler's grand design. But the most insidious control was not in the grand vistas or the winding paths. It was hidden in the very mathematics of the stones themselves. Ancient rulers discovered that by weaving sacred geometry into their structures, they could make their authority feel as natural and inevitable as the sunrise. This was the third strategy, a silent language of shapes and ratios that spoke directly to the subconscious. The human brain is hardwired to find certain patterns and proportions inherently pleasing, a concept modern psychologists call cognitive fluency. When a design is easy for our minds to process, we not only find it beautiful, we are also more likely to trust it and accept it as correct. The architect kings of Greece exploited this flawlessly. They designed temples like the Parthenon using the golden ratio, a specific mathematical proportion of approximately 1.618. This ratio appears in the relationship between the building's width and height, the spacing of its columns, even the layout of its inner chambers. To the citizen gazing up, the temple did not just look magnificent, it felt fundamentally right and harmonious. This subconscious sense of order and balance was then subconsciously transferred to the state and the gods the temple represented, making their power seem equally natural and divinely ordained. The Egyptian pyramid builders were even more precise. The exact angles and proportions of the Great Pyramid were not merely architectural feats, they were cosmological statements. The sides are aligned with the cardinal directions with astonishing accuracy, and the ratio of its perimeter to its original height mirrors the ratio of a circle's circumference to its radius. This was a massive, silent declaration that the pharaoh's rule was a direct reflection of the mathematical order of the universe itself. His authority was not just political, it was a law of nature. This use of mathematical order to induce a state of reverent acceptance reached its zenith in Islamic architecture. Here, the goal was to represent the infinite and transcendent nature of God. Walls and domes were covered in incredibly complex, repeating geometric patterns. These were not random decorations. The endless repetition of stars, polygons, and interlacing lines, all generated from a single, perfect circle, was designed to draw the viewer into a deep, contemplative state. Your eye tries to follow the pattern to find a beginning or an end, but it cannot. This deliberate, beautiful complexity induces a sense of awe and intellectual surrender. In that state of mind, the spiritual authority of the caliph, as God's representative on earth, felt absolute and unquestionable. The silent persuasion of sacred geometry made power seem predestined. But what happened when rulers decided to shatter this perfect order entirely, to use confusion and chaos as their ultimate tool of control? Sometimes the most powerful control comes from chaos, not order. The fourth strategy of the architect king was to deliberately disorient, to turn space into a psychological maze that left visitors vulnerable and dependent. When you are lost, your critical thinking shuts down, and you become desperate for anyone who can offer a way out. This was a calculated manipulation of cognitive load, a principle modern science confirms, where the brain becomes so overwhelmed with processing its confusing surroundings that it has little capacity left for questioning authority. The legendary palace of Knossos on the island of Crete was a masterwork of this approach. Its sprawling, multi-level layout was a true labyrinth, with corridors that seemed to double back on themselves and rooms that appeared with no logical sequence. A visitor would quickly lose all sense of direction, their mind struggling to map the impossible floor plan. This profound disorientation reinforced the absolute authority of the king and his priests, the only ones who possessed the secret knowledge to navigate the maze. Their power was not just political, it was spatial. Medieval castle builders applied this same principle on a more defensive scale. They designed spiral staircases to ascend in a tight clockwise spiral. This was a brutal form of psychological and physical engineering. For a right-handed attacker charging upwards, their sword arm would be constricted, pinned against the central pillar. But for the right-handed defender standing above, They had ample room to swing their weapon. The staircase itself became a disorienting, claustrophobic funnel that systematically disadvantaged the invader, making the defender's position feel unnaturally powerful. This was control through engineered confusion, turning the very act of movement into a life or death puzzle. Centuries later in Mughal India, the imperial city of Fatehpur Sikri used confusion as a tool of ceremony. The path to the emperor's court was not a grand, straight boulevard. Instead, envoys and petitioners were led through a series of deliberately complex passages, narrow gateways, and sudden, bewildering courtyards. By the time they finally reached the audience hall, their mental bearings were shattered. They felt small, confused, and psychologically prepared for the awe-inspiring spectacle of the emperor enthroned in sublime order. This stark contrast between the chaotic journey and the tranquil destination made his authority feel like a sanctuary. In each of these cases, the ruler created a dependency. A lost person will naturally look for a guide, and in these architectural mazes, the only guide was the authority figure himself. This manipulation of space to create psychological reliance was devastatingly effective. But what happened when these rulers decided to manipulate not just your sense of direction, but your very senses of sound, smell, and touch? But the architect king's voice was not always silent. Sometimes it was the very air that spoke for them. The fifth and perhaps most intimate strategy was sensory manipulation, a masterful control of sound itself. Ancient builders discovered they could engineer acoustics to create profound auditory experiences that made political and religious authority feel not just seen, but heard everywhere at once. In the vast hypostyle hall of Egypt's Karnak temple, 134 colossal columns stand in a dense forest of stone. Their arrangement was no accident. The precise spacing and sheer mass of these pillars created an extraordinary acoustic effect. A priest whispering a prayer at one end of the hall could be heard with perfect clarity at the other, as if the stone itself carried his voice. For the common person standing in that space, this was not a clever trick of physics, it was a miracle. It made the words of the priest, and by extension the pharaoh he served, seem omnipresent and divine, a pervasive force you could not escape. Across the Mediterranean, Greek architects achieved a similar feat of auditory control. Their open-air amphitheaters were sculpted with mathematical precision. The specific curvature of the stone seats and the shape of the stage acted as a natural sound amplifier. An actor's voice or a politician's speech could travel cleanly to the very highest row, reaching every one of the thousands of spectators without seeming to shout. This created the powerful illusion that the words were not being projected, but were simply arriving, as if the gods themselves were speaking directly to the audience, using the human speaker as a mere vessel. This manipulation reached its most immersive form beneath the great domes of Byzantine churches. Here, architects designed spaces where sound did not travel in a straight line but swirled. A single chant would bounce off the curved interior, creating a long, lingering reverberation that made the music seem to emanate from the walls, the ceiling, from everywhere and nowhere at once. Worshippers were not just hearing a hymn, they were submerged within it, enveloped in a sensation that felt like the literal presence of God. Modern psychology identifies this as auditory dominance, the unique power of sound to overwhelm our other senses and dictate our emotional state. A sudden noise can make us jump, a soothing melody can calm us, and in these ancient spaces, a perfectly engineered whisper could command absolute belief. By controlling the very physics of sound, rulers made their authority an inescapable sensory reality. The air itself became their messenger, yet if they could command the air, what then of their command over light itself? Light was the final, most ethereal tool in the architect king's arsenal. They did not merely build with stone, but with shadow and illumination, crafting spaces that felt divinely animated. This sixth strategy transformed the sun itself into a servant of power. In the deep interiors of Egyptian temples, this was a psychological masterstroke. A visitor would begin their journey in the bright, open courtyard, accessible to many. Then they would move into a hypostyle hall, its forest of columns creating a dim, filtered light. Finally, only the pharaoh and his highest priests could proceed into the sanctuary, a windowless room plunged into near-total darkness, illuminated only by flickering torchlight. This deliberate progression from brilliant sunlight to profound shadow was a physical metaphor for the transition from common knowledge to sacred, exclusive mystery. The ruler who controlled this journey from light to dark was not just a political leader, he was a gatekeeper to the divine. Across the world and centuries later, Gothic cathedral builders achieved a similar feat with the opposite approach. They did not restrict light, they glorified it. Their soaring stone frames were punctuated by enormous stained glass windows. These were not just decorations, they were carefully engineered light filters. At specific times of day, the sun would pour through, casting pools of jewel-toned color across the stone floor and filling the vast space with an ethereal, otherworldly glow. For a medieval worshipper, this was not a trick of physics, it was a direct manifestation of God's presence. The building itself seemed to breathe with heavenly light, and by extension, the church that built it held the keys to that heaven. This manipulation of light to create emotional awe is rooted in a perceptual principle modern science calls luminance contrast. Our brains are wired to respond powerfully to the stark transition between light and dark. A sudden shift can trigger alertness, fear, or profound reverence. The Inca emperors at Machu Picchu weaponized this principle with astronomical precision. They constructed temples and windows aligned to capture the sun's rays only on the mornings of the solstices. On those specific days, a single, perfect beam of light would strike a sacred stone or mark a ceremonial seat. This transformed a predictable solar event into a breathtaking spectacle that appeared to be a personal communication between the sun god and the emperor. His authority was not just declared by his words, but demonstrated by the cosmos, with the mountains and the sun as his witnesses. Through this brilliant choreography of illumination, rulers made their power feel like a natural, responsive, and living force. The very materials they chose to reflect this light would become their final, lasting testament. The very stones they walked upon were chosen to manipulate the mind. Beyond light and sound, the seventh strategy of the architect kings lay in the raw materials themselves, substances selected for their profound psychological weight. Roman emperors did not simply build with marble because it was strong. They imported vast quantities of gleaming white stone from quarries hundreds of miles away at an unimaginable cost. This was a deliberate statement. The cool, smooth, luminous surface of marble was meant to symbolize purity, imperial glory, and a permanence that would outlast any human life. To walk through a forum paved and pillared in this radiant stone was to feel the empire's wealth and eternal power in the soles of your feet and the palm of your hand. This is a concept anthropologists call haptic perception, the way the tactile qualities of a material directly influence our psychological state. The smooth, cold touch of marble communicated order, control, and a civilization that had mastered nature itself. A similar but even more ethereal effect was achieved in the Byzantine Empire. Inside the Hagia Sophia, the architects rejected solid, heavy walls in favor of surfaces sheathed in millions of gold mosaic tiles. The goal was not to show wealth but to dissolve reality. These shimmering surfaces captured and multiplied the light from countless lamps, creating an atmosphere that seemed to float, weightless and divine. This glittering, unstable environment induced a powerful feeling of transcendence, making the religious authority of the emperor and the church feel equally boundless and beyond earthly challenge. Far across the world, the Maya rulers of Mesoamerica spoke a different but equally potent material language. Their towering pyramids were not the dull gray stone we see today. They were once covered in bright, vividly colored stucco. Specific hues were not arbitrary, they were deeply symbolic. A brilliant red might represent blood, life, and the east where the sun was born, while a deep blue-green could symbolize water, fertility, and the sacred underworld. By coating their monuments in these symbolic colors, the Maya kings visually linked their own power to the fundamental cosmic principles that governed their world. The rough, painted texture of the stucco under your hand was a constant, tactile reminder of this connection. This silent, sensory language of materials created a non-verbal argument for authority that bypassed conscious thought entirely. The cool marble, the shimmering gold, the rough, colored plaster, each worked on the subconscious to prepare the mind for what came next, the final and most personal psychological barrier of all, the threshold you were not permitted to cross. The final barrier was not a wall, but the moment you passed through it. Architect kings mastered the psychology of the threshold, the potent space between spaces. A doorway or a gate became far more than an entrance. It was a physical manifestation of a social rule, a place where your very identity could be transformed. The Ishtar Gate of Babylon was not merely a defense against armies, it was a psychological filter. Its towering, glazed brick splendor, adorned with dragons and bulls, marked a violent transition from the perceived chaos of the wild desert to the absolute colored order of the king's city. To walk beneath its arch was to accept that you were now entering a world defined by his law. This principle of the powerful boundary was replicated across the globe. In medieval Europe, the castle's drawbridge and portcullis created more than a physical gap. They forged a symbolic chasm. The act of the bridge lowering and the iron grate rising was a performance of privilege, a stark reminder of the division between the protected, elite inside, and the vulnerable, excluded outside. Your pause at that threshold was a moment of enforced recognition of your place. In Japan, the shoguns designed their castles as a series of concentric moats and imposing walls. Each waterway and barrier you crossed did not just bring you closer to the center of power, it systematically stripped away your connection to the common world. The psychological distance created was as formidable as the physical defenses. Modern environmental psychology identifies this as the edge effect, the heightened awareness and altered behavior we naturally experience at any sharp boundary between two different spaces. By designing these transitions to be dramatic and intimidating, rulers weaponized this innate human response. The very act of crossing became a ritual of submission. Whether you were a merchant waiting for a bridge to lower or a peasant gazing across a forbidden moat, the architecture was constantly teaching you the same lesson: some belong inside and you belong out. This relentless reinforcement of hierarchy through doorways and gates laid the foundation for an even more pervasive form of control, the silent scripting of daily life in the public square. Even the straightest lines could be a lie designed for your eyes. The ninth and perhaps most cunning strategy of the architect king was the use of forced perspective and visual illusions, a sophisticated manipulation of sight itself to bend reality to their will. These were not mere decorative tricks, they were deliberate psychological operations built into stone and space. Forced perspective, the art of making objects appear larger, smaller, or farther away than they truly are, became a silent language of deception. In the grand palaces of the Renaissance, a visiting dignitary might walk down a corridor that seemed perfectly level and grand. unbeknownst to them, the ceiling was gradually, imperceptibly lowering with every step they took. By the time they entered the throne room to stand before the ruler, their body had unconsciously compensated for the shrinking space, forcing them into a slight but undeniable bow. This was not a gesture of willing respect. It was a physical reaction engineered by the architecture itself, a brilliant coercion of the body to signal submission to the mind. The ancient Greeks had perfected a similar subtlety centuries earlier. Look at a temple like the Parthenon, and your brain tells you are seeing a structure of perfect, soaring straight lines. The reality is a masterpiece of calculated distortion. The massive columns are not straight at all. They bulge slightly in the middle and tilt infinitesimally inward. The temple's base curves almost invisibly upward at the center. The Greek architects knew that truly straight lines would appear to sag and distort to the human eye from a distance, so they built in these subtle curves to create the flawless optical illusion of perfection. This was a powerful demonstration that their command extended beyond mere stone, reaching into the very mechanics of human perception. This grand-scale deception reached its zenith at Versailles. The palace's vast gardens were not just a beautiful landscape, they were a colossal exercise in forced perspective. The long, central canal was designed to appear shorter and more intimate from the king's balcony, making his domain seem effortlessly comprehensible and entirely within his grasp. Meanwhile, for a visitor standing at the far end, the palace appeared impossibly distant and vast, its scale exaggerated by the converging lines of the landscaping. This single view communicated two simultaneous messages: to the king, total control, and to the subject, overwhelming distance. These illusions work by exploiting a fundamental principle of our brain known as perceptual constancy. Our minds are hardwired to make quick, efficient sense of the visual world, often filling in gaps and making assumptions based on limited information. The architect kings became masters of this vulnerability, engineering specific vantage points that guaranteed our brains would interpret the scene in a way that flattered their power. They made their palaces seem more eternal, their connection to nature more seamless, and their authority more geometrically perfect than any mere truth could provide. This architectural sleight of hand transformed their reign from a simple fact of governance into an unquestionable law of optics. The city itself became the ultimate expression of the architect king's vision, a machine for social engineering built on a colossal scale. This 10th strategy moved beyond individual buildings to shape entire urban landscapes into comprehensive psychological conditioning systems. The layout of a city was never accidental. It was a deliberate blueprint for controlling how people lived, moved, and interacted every single day. The rigid grid pattern of Roman cities like Timgad in North Africa was a perfect example of this imperial logic. Those perfectly straight, intersecting streets were not just about efficient drainage or property lines. They were the physical manifestation of military order and imperial control. Troops could march swiftly to any disturbance, and surveillance was effortless from the long, unobstructed vistas. This geometric precision made rebellion not just difficult but feel unnatural, as if going against the very order of the world the Romans had built. The city itself trained its inhabitants in discipline and obedience simply through the relentless logic of its streets. On the other hand, the winding, labyrinthine alleys of medieval Islamic cities like Fez in Morocco achieved a different but equally powerful form of control. This organic, seemingly chaotic layout was a masterwork of social engineering. It fostered intense community cohesion within each neighborhood, creating private, defensible spaces that were difficult for outsiders to penetrate or understand. The city design made external invasion and internal surveillance a nightmare for any conquering army. while ensuring that social life and commerce flowed according to deeply ingrained traditional patterns. This was control through complexity and local identity rather than imperial simplicity. Perhaps the most ambitious fusion of cosmic order and urban control was the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan. Built on an island in the middle of a lake, its design was a breathtaking act of architectural will. The city was laid out with precisely oriented causeways and canals that did more than just move people and goods. They mirrored the Aztec understanding of the cosmos, with its 4 cardinal directions and sacred center. This meant that a citizen's daily journey to the market or the temple was also a constant physical reinforcement of their place in a universe divinely ruled by the emperor. The city's very geography made the state's ideology an inescapable lived experience. All of these urban designs operated on a principle sociologists call environmental determinism. It is the powerful idea that our physical surroundings directly shape our social organization and even our individual behavior. By designing cities that made certain actions feel natural and others feel difficult or alien, rulers could engineer the social outcomes they desired without needing soldiers on every corner. The city itself became the silent, ever-present enforcer of political and cultural norms. It created self-regulating societies where people policed their own behavior, believing they were simply following the natural flow of the streets, a flow that had been meticulously planned from the very beginning to guide them. The stones they left behind were not just monuments, they were history books written by the victors. This 11th strategy of the architect king was architectural memorialization, the use of structures to control not just the present mind but the memory of the future. By building in stone, rulers could dictate how they would be remembered for centuries, crafting a legacy so physically immense it felt like an unchangeable fact. The victory columns of Rome stand as perfect examples of this historical editing in 3 dimensions. Emperor Trajan's column in Rome is not merely a pillar, it is a spiraling stone scroll telling the story of his military campaigns. But this was not an objective history, it was a masterful piece of propaganda. The carvings showed Trajan as a brilliant, invincible commander, his soldiers as disciplined heroes, and his enemies as chaotic barbarians. Every Roman citizen who looked up at that column was absorbing a carefully sanitized and glorified version of events, one that cemented Trajan's image as the ideal emperor for generations to come. The stone made the story permanent and seemingly undeniable. In Egypt, this manipulation of memory took a more brutal form. Pharaohs would routinely order the systematic defacement of their predecessors' monuments. Names were chiseled away, faces were smashed, and entire cartouches were erased from temple walls. Then, they would build their own grand structures directly on top of the old foundations, literally using the rubble of the past to elevate their own glory. This was not random vandalism, it was a calculated political act, a way to chisel a rival out of history itself while making one's own reign appear as the only logical divine succession. A similar, though more transformative, ambition drove King Jayavarman VII in Cambodia. He did not just build another temple, he reconstructed the entire city of Angkor Thom as a massive stone model of the Buddhist universe. His face, in the form of the compassionate Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, was carved onto towers gazing serenely over every entrance. By reshaping the urban landscape into a physical manifestation of Buddhist principles, he permanently rewrote the spiritual identity of his kingdom. He justified his rule not just through power, but through a visible, architectural religious revolution that future generations would inherit as the natural order. Historians call this powerful effect material mnemonics, the way physical objects and spaces actively shape what a society collectively remembers and forgets. When a ruler's version of events is the one carved into the mountainside or towering over the city square, it becomes the default narrative. It creates a self-perpetuating legitimacy, where the very landscape argues for the ruler's greatness long after his dynasty has turned to dust. This deep desire for permanence, to align one's power with the unchanging cycles of the world, inevitably drew the architect-king's gaze upward, to the one clock that never failed, the cosmos itself. The final and most profound strategy of the architect-king reached for the heavens themselves. By anchoring their monuments to the cosmos, rulers transformed their authority from a temporary command into an eternal, celestial law. This was the ultimate psychological validation, making their power appear not just sanctioned by the gods, but woven into the very fabric of the universe. We see this breathtaking ambition at Stonehenge on the Salisbury Plain. Its massive stones were not arranged randomly, but precisely aligned to frame the sunrise on the summer solstice. When the first ray of light pierced through the central archway on that specific morning, it was not merely a solar event, it was a state-sponsored spectacle. The king was not just performing a ritual, he was demonstrating his ability to orchestrate a meeting between the earth and the sky, positioning himself as the essential link between his people and the cosmic cycle. This is what anthropologists call cosmological mapping, the innate human desire to find patterns that connect our world to the heavens, and the architect-kings became masters of this deep-seated need. 1,000 years later and an ocean away, the Maya rulers of Chichen Itza engineered an even more dramatic celestial demonstration. The Castillo Pyramid is a masterpiece of astronomical theater. On the spring and autumn equinoxes, the setting sun casts a series of triangular shadows down the northern staircase. These shadows interlock with the stone serpent heads at the base, creating the breathtaking illusion of a massive, undulating serpent slithering down from the temple to the earth. For the assembled crowd, this was not an illusion of light and shadow. It was a direct manifestation of Kukulkan, the feathered serpent god. The king, standing at the summit, was not merely a spectator, he was the catalyst, the human conduit through which this divine power flowed. His connection to the celestial forces was made visible, undeniable, and terrifyingly real. In imperial China, this cosmic mapping was woven into the very plan of the Forbidden City. Its entire layout was designed as a mirror of the northern heavens, with the emperor's throne room positioned as the earthly counterpart to the North Star. Just as every other star in the sky appears to revolve around that fixed celestial pole, so too did every official, every citizen, and every function of the state revolve around the Son of Heaven. This was not a subtle metaphor, it was an architectural fact. By walking through his city, a person was physically reenacting their place in a cosmos where the emperor was the central, unmoving axis. This celestial validation created a psychological foundation for authority that was virtually unassailable. To question the ruler was not just treason, it was to argue with the mathematics of the planets and the ordained path of the sun. It elevated the king from a mortal leader to an essential component of universal order, and just as they commanded the sky above, these rulers learned to command the very flow of water to shape the world below. Water itself became a liquid instrument of power. The 13th strategy of the architect-king flowed from the precise control of water, transforming this essential element into a sophisticated psychological tool. Elaborate fountains, serene canals, and vast artificial lakes were never just practical amenities. They were breathtaking displays of a ruler's ability to command nature itself. In a world where water meant life, the ruler who could make it dance and flow at his whim presented himself not just as a political leader, but as a life-giving force. The public fountains of ancient Rome, predecessors to marvels like the Trevi Fountain, were masterclasses in this public relations strategy. They showcased staggering engineering genius, bringing fresh water across impossible distances through aqueducts. For the common citizen, this was not an abstract achievement. It was a daily, tangible benefit. The sight and sound of clean, flowing water in the heart of the city created immense popular support, linking the emperor's reign directly with public health and prosperity. It was power made refreshingly clear. In the arid landscapes of Moorish Spain, the caliphs perfected a more subtle form of hydraulic control. The Generalife Gardens in Granada were a living paradise engineered with mathematical precision. Narrow canals, known as acequias, fed a network of fountains, pools, and irrigation channels that created cool, humid microclimates amidst the desert heat. The gentle, constant sound of trickling water and the sight of its reflective surfaces offered a sensory refuge. This was not merely beautiful landscaping, it was a deliberate demonstration that the caliph could replicate the Quranic description of paradise on earth, positioning his rule as both divinely inspired and personally beneficial. His authority was felt in every cool breeze that rustled through the gardens. On a truly monumental scale, the kings of the Khmer Empire at Ankara built the West Barre, an artificial reservoir so massive it stretched for 8 kilometers. Constructing this aquatic marvel required mobilizing tens of thousands of laborers for years, moving unimaginable volumes of earth. The lake was a permanent, undeniable testament to the king's ability to command vast resources and control the most vital resource for his entire civilization. Its placid surface was a constant, calming reminder of his power to provide sustenance and prevent famine. These displays tapped into a deep, hardwired human instinct known as biophilia, our innate and powerful attraction to life-giving natural elements like water. The sight and sound of clean, managed water triggers a subconscious response of peace, safety, and pleasure. By becoming the sole provider of this aesthetically perfected resource, the ruler made his subjects psychologically dependent on his continued benevolence. He was the source of life, the civilization builder, and this liquid dependency flowed directly into unwavering political loyalty. This command over the natural environment was the final piece in a grand design, one that moved from controlling the cosmos to directing the very flow of life-sustaining water, all to shape the human mind from the inside out. The walls of a palace were far more than decoration. They were psychological engines fine-tuning the human mind for obedience. While grand exteriors made powerful statements, it was inside these structures that the most intimate forms of control took root. The 14th strategy of the architect king was interior psychology, the deliberate arrangement of rooms and spaces to reinforce social hierarchy and condition behavior from the inside out. This was achieved through a masterful choreography of progression, moving visitors from public areas into increasingly private and exclusive zones. Each threshold crossed was not just a physical step, but a psychological promotion, a tangible reward that deepened one's investment in the system. In the vast Persian palaces, the journey to the king was a carefully staged spectacle. The Apadana, or Grand Audience Hall, was supported by forests of towering, slender columns. Walking through this stone forest was a disorienting and awe-inspiring experience. The repeating vertical lines broke up the space, creating a rhythmic, almost hypnotic visual field that made the distant figure of the king appear as the only stable, focal point in a supernatural realm. You were not just entering a room, you were transitioning into his personal domain of power. Medieval European castles operated on a similar principle of spatial hierarchy, but with a more communal focus. The Great Hall was the undeniable heart of the castle, a vast, open space where the Lord presided over meals and gatherings. Its design was a perfect balance of intimidation and inclusion. The lord and his family sat on a raised dais at one end, ensuring they were visible to everyone in the room. This arrangement allowed the lord to publicly perform his generosity by hosting feasts, while his elevated position constantly reminded every gathered subject of the unbreachable social gap between them. The architecture facilitated a display of authority that felt both personal and absolute. In Japan, the Shoin style of architecture perfected a more subtle form of interior control. Rooms were designed with specific, fixed features like staggered shelves and a decorative alcove called the tokonoma. This alcove was never just an empty space. It was a sacred focal point reserved for a single, carefully chosen object, perhaps a priceless scroll, a piece of pottery, or a flower arrangement. The entire layout of the room, from the placement of the mats to the lines of the shelves, conspired to draw every guest's gaze toward this symbol of cultural or political authority. Your attention was not your own to direct. It was gently but firmly commanded by the design of the space itself. All of these techniques are part of a field known as proxemics, the study of how we use space in our social interactions. The architect kings were intuitive masters of this concept long before it had a name. By controlling spatial relationships, sightlines, and movement patterns indoors, they made complex social hierarchies feel as natural and unchangeable as the walls around you. The architecture itself taught you your place, rewarding compliance with access and punishing dissent with exclusion, all without a word of command. This silent scripting of behavior through interior design was a masterpiece of psychological control, a subtlety that would soon find its perfect partner in the strategic use of color. Color itself became a silent command painted across the stones of power. Beyond the arrangement of space and the control of light, the 15th strategy of the architect king was a masterful manipulation of chromatic psychology. These rulers understood that specific hues carried profound cultural meanings, and they saturated their architectural environments with these symbolic colors to reinforce their messages on a subconscious level. Different civilizations developed their own sophisticated color languages, embedding them directly into the very surfaces people saw every day. In ancient Egypt, the brilliant blue known as Egyptian frit was far more than a pigment. It was the color of the heavens, of divinity and divine protection. This is why the ceilings of royal tombs and the inner sanctums of temples were so often painted with this vibrant, lapis lazuli-derived blue, studded with golden stars. To stand beneath that celestial canopy was to feel the pharaoh's direct connection to the gods, a connection that enveloped and protected you. The color itself was a visual argument for his sacred right to rule. On the other side of the world, Chinese emperors claimed an entire color for their exclusive use. The gleaming yellow glaze on the roof tiles of the Forbidden City was not an aesthetic choice, it was a cosmological declaration. In Chinese philosophy, yellow was the color of the center, the balancing point between heaven and earth. By reserving this hue for their palaces, the emperors visually cemented their role as the sons of heaven, the essential pivot around which all of civilization revolved. It was a constant, glowing reminder that their authority was not just political, but a fundamental force of cosmic harmony. Meanwhile, in the jungles of Mesoamerica, Mayan rulers used a strikingly different but equally potent color. Their pyramids and palaces were once covered in a vibrant, startling red ochre. This color was deeply symbolic of blood, which represented life force, sacrifice, and royal lineage. By painting their cities red, the Maya kings visually connected their own power to the vital essence that sustained the world and to the ancestral bloodlines that justified their rule. You were not just looking at a red building, you were looking at a statement written in the color of life itself. These strategies work through a principle modern neuroaesthetics researchers call color-emotion linking. This is the powerful, often automatic connection our brains make between specific colors and emotional states. A cool blue can evoke feelings of peace and stability. A radiant yellow can signal centrality and warmth, and a bold red can trigger arousal and intensity. By saturating their architectural worlds with these symbolically charged hues, rulers could create specific psychological atmospheres that reinforced their desired narratives without a single explicit command. The very surfaces people looked at became a form of constant, subtle programming, a visual conditioning that prepared the mind for obedience. This silent language of color, working in concert with pattern and form, completed a sensory tapestry of control that was both beautiful and profoundly manipulative. The very patterns carved into stone could program the human mind. The 16th strategy of the architect king was pattern repetition, a relentless visual rhythm that used our brain's own wiring to make ideology feel inevitable. This is a principle modern psychology calls cognitive priming, where repeated exposure to a specific stimulus prepares the mind to more readily accept associated ideas. Architectural motifs repeated over and over became a form of silent, constant reinforcement, a visual chant that echoed through the corridors of power. In the hypostyle halls of ancient Egypt, you were surrounded by a forest of columns, each one carved with the same ceaseless pattern of lotus and papyrus plants. These were not random botanical choices. The lotus symbolized the sun and rebirth, while the papyrus represented the fertile Nile marsh. Their endless repetition on every surface was a visual mantra, reinforcing the idea of an eternal, self-renewing cycle of creation, a cycle that the pharaoh alone was responsible for maintaining. Your brain, absorbing this repetitive visual data, began to accept this cosmic order as a simple, observable fact of the world. Across the Mediterranean, Greek architects achieved a different kind of harmony through repetition. Look up at the Doric frieze of a temple like the Parthenon, and you see a strict, alternating pattern of triglyphs and metopes. The triglyph, with its 3 vertical grooves, is followed by a metope, a carved panel depicting a mythological scene. This rhythm is unbreakable. It creates a visual cadence that feels mathematically perfect and deeply satisfying to the human eye. This architectural rhythm was a direct reflection of the Greek philosophical ideal of sophrosyne, a balanced and disciplined mind. The building itself, through its repetitive order, was teaching you the mental state required to be a good citizen of the polis. But perhaps the most hypnotic use of pattern repetition came from the Islamic world. Here, architects covered entire walls and domes with intricate geometric tessellations. These were not just decorations, they were cognitive traps. Your eye tries to follow a single line in an arabesque pattern, searching for a beginning or an end, but it finds only an infinite, interlacing web. This deliberate, beautiful complexity induces a state of intellectual surrender, suggesting the boundless, incomprehensible nature of God. And since the caliph was God's representative on earth, his authority felt equally infinite and all-encompassing. This psychological effect taps into a brain function known as pattern completion. When we see part of a familiar design, our brain automatically fills in the rest, extending the pattern in our mind's eye. The architect kings exploited this flawlessly. By embedding their ideological messages within these repetitive structures, they ensured that your own subconscious mind would continue the work of reinforcing their power long after you looked away. You were not just seeing the pattern, you were completing it, becoming an active participant in your own psychological conditioning. This silent, repetitive language made the ruler's authority feel less like an external command and more like an intrinsic truth, a rhythm as natural as your own heartbeat. A building could become the very soul of a community. Beyond the subtle control of individual minds, The 17th strategy of the architect king was architectural unification, the deliberate use of design to forge a single, collective identity from a diverse population. These rulers understood that shared symbols and spaces could bind people together more effectively than any law, transforming scattered subjects into a cohesive people with a common purpose. This was not about suppressing individuality, but about redirecting it towards a collective ideal that served the state. The Roman Empire was a master of this technique. From Britain to Syria, they constructed nearly identical forums, basilicas, and bathhouses. For a citizen in a distant province, walking into his local forum was like stepping into a miniature Rome. This visual and experiential consistency was a powerful psychological tool. It gave conquered peoples a tangible, prestigious identity to adopt, making them feel part of a vast, civilized world. Being Roman was no longer just about birthplace. It was about the shared experience of these grand, familiar spaces that defined public life. This is a principle social psychologists call social identity theory, our innate human drive to belong to a group that gives us status and meaning. The Romans provided that group, and its identity was carved in stone. In medieval Europe, a different kind of unification took shape, one that reached for the heavens. The great Gothic cathedral building campaigns were not just architectural projects, they were societal ones. For decades, entire towns would pour their resources and labor into raising these monumental structures. A farmer might spend his weekends hauling stone, a merchant might donate a portion of his wealth, and a noble might fund a stained glass window. The cathedral became a source of immense local pride, a collective achievement that belonged to everyone. Yet, while each cathedral was unique, their shared Gothic language of pointed arches and flying buttresses created a visual bond across Christendom, reinforcing a pan-European Christian identity that transcended local rivalries. The Church and the kings who supported it positioned themselves as the patrons and protectors of this unifying spiritual ambition. Meanwhile, across Southeast Asia, Buddhist kings achieved a similar feat of architectural diplomacy. The distinctive bell-shaped stupa, often crowned with a series of parasols, became a unifying symbol across kingdoms from Sri Lanka to Myanmar. While local variations existed, the core design was instantly recognizable. A pilgrim traveling hundreds of miles would find a familiar architectural form marking sacred sites, creating a profound sense of religious continuity and solidarity that ignored political borders. This shared architectural language reinforced the idea of a universal Buddhist community, a Sangha, and the king who built the most magnificent stupa was seen as its greatest patron and defender. In each case, the ruler wove their own authority into the very fabric of a community's shared identity. The buildings people loved and identified with became constant, silent reminders of the power that made them possible. This created a psychological bond far stronger than fear, a genuine connection between the population and the ruler that transformed coercive power into loyal affiliation. And when that community felt threatened, the architect king had one final, formidable strategy to deploy: the psychology of the fortress. The fortress wall was more than a barrier, it was a state of mind. The 18th strategy of the architect king was defensive architecture, a dual-purpose design that provided physical security while forging a powerful psychological bond of dependence. These massive walls and fortifications were not just practical necessities, they were brilliant public relations campaigns in stone, shaping how entire populations perceived safety, threat, and the ruler who stood between them. The Great Wall of China snaked across mountains and deserts, creating a visible, undeniable line between the emperor's civilized world and the perceived chaos of the northern steppes. For the incredibly diverse communities living in its shadow, the wall served as a constant, unifying symbol. It gave them a common external enemy to define themselves against, transforming a collection of different peoples into a single Chinese identity protected by the Son of Heaven. His legitimacy was built not just on mandate, but on the monumental promise of security. In medieval Europe, the experience was more intimate. A city's walls did more than keep invaders out, they created a psychological container. Living within those stone rings defined who belonged and who did not. The gates that were locked at night, the watchmen on the parapets, all of it fostered a powerful sense of community membership that was entirely dependent on the central authority, whether a king or a local lord, that maintained the defenses. Your safety was literally built into the stones around you, and that safety had a single, recognizable source. This feeling of being uniquely shielded reached its zenith in Constantinople. The great capital of the Byzantine Empire was protected by not one, but 3 concentric rings of massive walls interspersed with deep moats. This created layers of security that were both physical and profoundly psychological. A resident knew that any invader would have to break through not just a first line, but a second and a third. This layered defense made people feel exceptionally and uniquely protected by imperial power, fostering a deep-seated loyalty to the emperor who was the architect of their safety. These structures all operated on a principal security experts call deterrence by denial. It is the powerful psychological impact of visible, formidable defensive capabilities. The very sight of a massive wall sends a message to both the people inside and any potential enemy outside. This place is protected. This place is different. This place is worth defending. By creating these imposing structures, rulers positioned themselves as the essential, irreplaceable guarantors of peace and order. The experience of living within these designed systems created a powerful dependency. During a siege, when fear was at its peak, the population's reliance on the ruler and his defensive architecture became absolute. This psychological need for protection translated directly into unwavering political loyalty, making the architect king's authority feel not just powerful, but fundamentally necessary for survival. And from the high walls that kept threats out, it was a simple step to the watchtowers that looked in, turning the city itself into a panopticon where the ruler's gaze felt ever present. Even the most private moments were never truly your own. The 19th strategy of the architect king was surveillance design, a masterful manipulation of space to create the unnerving and constant feeling of being watched. Long before the philosopher Jeremy Bentham gave it a name, rulers were building the panoptic effect directly into their palaces and cities, understanding that the mere possibility of observation could be more powerful than 1,000 guards. In ancient Egypt, elevated platforms known as mastaba were integrated into royal palace complexes. From these raised positions, the pharaoh or his officials could observe the comings and goings in the courtyards below, all while remaining partially obscured in the shadows of a colonnade. You could never be certain if you were being watched at any given moment, and that uncertainty was the entire point. It trained you to act as if you were always being judged. The Roman legions institutionalized this principle in their military camps. The commander's tent, the praetorium, was always strategically positioned at the center of the grid, with the broadest possible views down the straight avenues. This ensured that the commanding officer's gaze, or the gaze of his sentries, could theoretically fall upon any soldier at any time. The design made constant visibility a fundamental fact of military life, a relentless disciplinary tool that forged discipline through architectural inevitability. On the other side of the world, traditional Korean homes used a more intimate form of this control. The central courtyard, or madang, was the heart of the household, surrounded by the family's living quarters. Its open design allowed the household head to monitor daily activities: children playing, servants working, guests arriving, from the relative privacy of his own room. This subtle arrangement enforced family hierarchy and social norms without a word of command, encouraging self-regulation through the gentle but constant pressure of potential observation. This psychological phenomenon is what modern social scientists call social monitoring. Our behavior changes when we believe we might be seen. We conform to social rules more carefully, we police our own actions, and we internalize the standards of the authority we imagine is watching. By building environments that facilitated observation, the architect king outsourced the work of enforcement to the minds of his own subjects. The architecture itself became a silent, ever-present supervisor, a psychological condition that made authority feel pervasive even when it was absent. This invisible, watching presence prepared the human psyche for its final surrender, not to a god or a king, but to the meticulously engineered atmosphere of a sacred space. Your every step in a sacred space was a silent lesson in obedience. Ritual architecture became the 20th and perhaps most intimate strategy of the architect king, a method for turning physical movement into a direct expression of power. These were not just buildings for ceremony, they were sophisticated behavioral scripts carved in stone, choreographing every gesture to make abstract hierarchies feel as real and unavoidable as the ground beneath your feet. In Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem, the design was a precise blueprint for social order. The structure's exact dimensions created a series of concentric zones of holiness. The common Israelite could only enter the outer courts, while the priests performed sacrifices in the inner areas, and only the high priest, just once a year, could pass through the veil into the Holy of Holies. This physical layout did not just separate people, it taught a powerful lesson through enforced positioning. Your assigned place in the ritual was a direct and visible manifestation of your place in the social and religious hierarchy, a lesson you learned not from a scroll, but from the very space you were forbidden to cross. Across the ocean, the Mesoamerican ball courts served a similarly profound purpose. The game played there was far more than a sport. The stone rings, mounted high on the court's walls, were positioned at a height that made scoring nearly impossible, requiring immense skill or perhaps divine favor. Scoring a goal was a rare, electrifying event that reenacted a cosmic myth, often the story of heroic gods battling the forces of darkness. The players were not just athletes, they were actors in a sacred drama, and the court itself, with its specific orientation and symbolic markers, was the stage. The architecture transformed physical exertion into a ritual that visually reinforced the ruler's connection to the celestial struggle and its outcome. This principle of progressive revelation and restriction was perfected in Hindu temple design. The classic temple layout, the Vastupurusha mandala, is a sacred geometric diagram made physical. To approach the inner sanctum, the Garbhagriha, you move through a series of increasingly smaller and darker spaces, passing through multiple gateways and halls. Each threshold you cross represents a stage of spiritual advancement, moving from the outer world of illusion to the inner core of truth. This architectural journey powerfully reinforced the authority of the Brahmin priests, who were the sole guides permitted to navigate this symbolic path and access the divine presence at its heart. Anthropologists describe this powerful mechanism as praxis, the process by which our repeated physical actions gradually shape our deepest beliefs. When you bow in a low-ceilinged passage, when you stand in a designated courtyard, or when you follow a prescribed path, you are not just moving, you are internalizing a script. The architecture demands the action, and the repeated action forges the belief. Participants literally embody the power structures the building represents, creating a deep, muscle memory association between the space they inhabit and the social order they are meant to accept. This physical scripting made ideology feel less like an idea and more like a natural law, a lesson written not on parchment, but in the very positioning of the body itself. Even a ruined building could be a powerful tool for a new ruler. The 21st strategy of the architect king was architectural restoration as political legitimation, a sophisticated process of selectively preserving and reconstructing older structures to forge visible links to a revered past. Rulers grasped that by maintaining or modifying historic buildings, they could position themselves as the guardians of tradition and the rightful heirs to previous legitimate authorities. This was not about pure historical preservation, it was a calculated act of political theater. Roman emperors were masters of this approach. They would frequently fund the restoration of temples from the Republican era or earlier dynasties. By doing so, they publicly associated their own reign with Rome's glorious history while demonstrating personal piety and civic virtue. It was a way of saying, I am not destroying the past, I am completing it, and my power is the natural continuation of all that came before. In Renaissance Europe, the popes employed an even more ambitious version of this strategy. They launched massive campaigns to restore and embellish the early Christian basilicas of Rome, structures like St. Peter's. This immense architectural project was a clear statement of their authority. They were positioning themselves as the direct and unchallenged successors to the first church fathers, using the physical fabric of the ancient churches to weave a narrative of unbroken spiritual and political lineage. In Japan, the shoguns perfected a delicate architectural dance. For centuries, they carefully maintained and funded the imperial palaces in Kyoto, even while they, the shoguns, held all the actual military and political power from their own capitals. This was a brilliant demonstration of their public respect for the traditional authority of the emperor. By upholding the architectural symbols of the imperial institution, they legitimized their own rule as the necessary protectors of the established order, all while keeping the emperor a revered but powerless figure. These restoration practices operated through what historians call invented tradition, the selective emphasis on certain historical elements to legitimize current power arrangements. By becoming the custodians of significant architecture, rulers created a visible continuity between their reign and the revered figures of the past. This made their authority feel like a natural and inevitable extension of history rather than a disruptive break. The built environment became a carefully curated timeline of legitimacy, visually connecting present power to its historical foundations. This deep desire for continuity through architecture connects directly to the opposite impulse, the use of fleeting, temporary structures to command immediate and spectacular attention. Even the most fleeting structure could command absolute belief. The 22nd strategy of the architect king was ephemeral architecture, a brilliant use of temporary constructions to create psychological impacts of overwhelming intensity precisely because they were not built to last. These were not lesser structures but concentrated doses of power, designed to deliver a spectacular message that would burn itself into public memory before it could ever become familiar. The Roman triumph was a masterclass in this temporary transformation. A conquering general did not just parade through the city, he marched through a Rome that had been utterly remade for a single day. Elaborate temporary arches spanned the streets, buildings were draped in garlands and rich fabrics, and stages were erected for theatrical performances. This created an overwhelming, all-encompassing sensory environment that celebrated the victory. The sheer impermanence of it all made the event feel like a miraculous interruption of daily life, a gift from the general and the gods, cementing his glory in the public mind with an urgency no permanent monument could match. In medieval Europe, kings employed a similar tactic for coronations and royal weddings. They would commission vast, temporary extensions to their palaces, magnificent pavilions and galleries built of wood and canvas but decorated to rival any stone hall. These structures served a crucial psychological purpose. They visually emphasized that the ceremony happening within them was a unique, transcendent moment in the life of the kingdom. The special, fleeting architecture framed the monarch's power as something extraordinary and elevated, an event so significant it required its own temporary world to contain it. The Mughal emperors of India took this concept into the realm of nature itself. For imperial audiences, they would order the construction of elaborate temporary gardens, complete with flowing water channels, fragrant flower beds, and delicate pavilions, all erected in a matter of days in the barren landscape. This was a breathtaking demonstration of the emperor's command not just over men and materials, but over the very order of the natural world. He could conjure a perfect miniature paradise for a single afternoon, only to let it vanish, proving his power was so vast he could afford to make beauty disappear. Modern event psychology identifies this powerful effect as a peak experience, an intense, unusual event that creates disproportionately strong and lasting memories. By fusing architectural spectacle with strict temporal limits, rulers created unforgettable peaks of emotional engagement. The very fact that these beautiful, imposing structures were here today and gone tomorrow emphasized the ruler's incredible capacity to marshal resources for a singular, magnificent moment. This fleeting theatricality made their authority feel both incredibly potent and entirely unquestionable, a lesson in power written not in stone but in time itself. Stories were not just told, they were built into the very walls. The 23rd strategy of the architect king was architectural narrative, transforming entire structures into three-dimensional storybooks that wrapped visitors in a physical tale of legitimacy. These were not passive decorations, but immersive environments where every surface whispered a carefully crafted mythology, connecting the ruler's power to the deepest cultural beliefs of the people. In the vast palaces of the Assyrian kings, this narrative was one of raw, intimidating power. The throne rooms were lined with massive alabaster reliefs that did not show single scenes, but continuous stories that unfolded along the walls. You would see the king as a mighty hunter triumphing over lions, and then as an unconquerable general, leading his armies to victory in a seamless visual flow. Walking through these rooms, you were not merely looking at art, you were walking through the king's story of his own invincibility, a story that became your reality for as long as you remained within his walls. This technique of wrapping a space in a continuous visual narrative is what literary scholars call deduce, the creation of a story world that the audience enters psychologically. The Assyrian king was not just telling you he was powerful, his architecture was making you live inside the proof. On the other side of the world, Hindu temple builders achieved a similar immersion with a spiritual purpose. The entire surface of a temple, from its base to its soaring tower, was often covered in thousands of intricate carvings depicting scenes from sacred epics like the Ramayana or the Mahabharata. These were not random religious images, they were a deliberate narrative program. The king who commissioned the temple was visually positioning himself as a patron continuing the divine work of the gods themselves, his earthly rule a direct extension of the cosmic order depicted in the stone. A pilgrim circling the temple was not just performing a ritual, they were reading a story that connected their king to the gods, making his authority feel spiritually authentic and preordained. Even when the medium was not stone, the principle remained the same. The Bayeux tapestry, a monumental embroidered cloth nearly 70 meters long, functioned as a portable architectural narrative. It tells the continuous story of William the Conqueror's invasion of England, presenting his claim to the throne as justified and his victory as inevitable. Displayed in a great hall, it would have enveloped viewers in William's version of history, a visual argument for his legitimate rule that was as powerful as any fortress wall. By building environments that physically embodied these foundational stories, rulers could make their power seem like a natural, even exciting, chapter in an ongoing cultural epic. The architecture became a script you walked through, teaching ideological lessons not through lectures, but through the powerful, unspoken language of spatial experience. This deep cultural authenticity forged a psychological bond that felt more genuine than any political decree, a bond that was further strengthened by the subtle way these spaces manipulated your very perception of time. They could even control your perception of time itself. The 24th strategy of the architect king was temporal manipulation, a sophisticated choreography of your movement through space to shape how you experienced every passing second. These designers understood that architecture is never static. It unfolds over time as you walk through it, and by controlling that pace and rhythm, they could dictate the emotional weight of your journey. The experience was engineered to feel either eternal or instantaneous, depending on the message power wanted to send. The ascent of a Mayan pyramid was a masterwork of this slow, deliberate control. The staircases were not just steep, they were often intentionally uneven and dauntingly high. This was not poor design, it was psychological engineering. The arduous, careful climb forced your body into a slow, laborious rhythm, your focus narrowing to each step. Your heart would pound, your breath would shorten, and the passage of time would seem to stretch. By the time you reached the summit, the prolonged physical effort and the extended duration of the ascent had built a tremendous sense of anticipation, making the final, breathtaking view and the presence of the priest-king feel like a hard-won, spiritually significant reward. The drawn-out time made the encounter with power feel deserved and profound. Across the world, Gothic cathedral builders manipulated time through a different kind of rhythm. The long nave of a cathedral is not a single, empty space. It is divided into a series of repeating bays marked by columns and arches. As you walk towards the altar, you pass through this rhythmic sequence of spaces, one after another, like the measured beats in a piece of sacred music. This architectural rhythm mirrored the liturgical sequence of the Mass itself, creating a harmonious flow between the physical structure and the religious ceremony. The repeated, predictable progression made time feel ordered, purposeful, and divinely orchestrated, seamlessly integrating the authority of the church into the very tempo of your visit. In Japan, the design of the tea ceremony house took temporal control to its most intimate level. The entrance, called the Nijirigachi, is a small, square opening that forces every guest, regardless of status, to bow deeply and crawl through one at a time. This is not merely a quaint tradition, it is a brilliant temporal gate. The act of slowing down, of contorting your body to enter, creates a distinct psychological pause, a deliberate transition that separates the chaotic, status-driven outside world from the serene, egalitarian space within. It forces a mental reset, making the time spent inside the terum feel separate, sacred, and entirely focused on the present moment. These techniques all operate on a principle psychologists call time perception, the deeply subjective way our minds measure duration based on emotion, physical effort, and sensory input. A boring minute can feel like an hour, while a thrilling hour can feel like a minute. The architect kings became masters of this vulnerability. They designed approaches that stretched time to build reverence, and transitions that compressed it to showcase their ability to command immediate, transformative change. This control over architectural time was the final, subtle layer of psychological influence, one that seamlessly connected the built environment to the ultimate temporal authority, the natural world itself. The ultimate illusion of power is making nature itself appear to obey your command. Rulers learned that by framing, taming, and incorporating the wild world into their designs, they could present their authority as a fundamental force of the cosmos. This 25th strategy turned gardens and landscapes into psychological demonstrations of total control. In Japan, the technique of shake, or borrowed scenery, was a masterstroke of this subtle deception. A shogun's garden would be designed not as a closed space, but as a living picture frame. Distant mountains, a far-off forest, or the sky itself would be intentionally captured within the view from a veranda or between carefully positioned trees. This made the boundless, untamed landscape appear as a deliberate part of the ruler's composition, as if the entire natural world was merely an extension of his personal estate. His domain felt limitless because it visually incorporated the horizon. On the other side of the world, the French formal gardens of Versailles pursued the opposite approach with equal psychological force. Here, nature was not borrowed, it was conquered. Every hedge was trimmed into a perfect geometric wall, every path laid out in rigid lines, and every fountain placed with mathematical precision. The wild, unpredictable growth of the natural world was forced into absolute submission, demonstrating the Sun King's power to impose his will not just on people, but on life itself. The garden became a living metaphor for a perfectly ordered state, where even the trees knew their place. Meanwhile, the Persian paradise gardens, the Chahar Bagh, presented a different kind of mastery. These were walled oases divided into 4 precise quarters by waterways, symbolizing the 4 rivers of paradise. Within these enclosed walls, the ruler recreated a miniature, perfect world. The design represented the entire cosmos brought into beautiful, harmonious submission. For a visitor walking through this ordered sanctuary, the message was clear. The king who could design such a paradise on earth held a power that was both worldly and divine. These nature framings all tap into a deep human longing that landscape theorists call the pastoral ideal. It is our innate desire to see nature as both beautiful and completely controlled, a safe and perfect garden. By creating environments that fulfilled this deep-seated wish, rulers made their authority feel comforting and inevitable. Their political order was visually linked to cosmic order, making any thought of resistance feel as foolish and unnatural as trying to stop the sun from rising. This silent, powerful association between a leader's command and the laws of nature itself remains one of the most enduring psychological tricks ever built into our world. These ancient strategies did not vanish, they simply found new patrons. The psychological principles forged by architect kings now shape the shopping malls, office towers, and government buildings of our modern world, often operating just beneath our conscious awareness. A sprawling shopping mall is a perfect contemporary example of this ancient logic. Its layout is rarely a simple grid. Instead, you are guided along winding, looping pathways designed to maximize the time you spend inside and the number of storefronts you pass. This is a direct descendant of the ceremonial pathways in ancient palaces, controlling your movement to create specific outcomes, in this case, commercial exposure instead of reverence. The controlled lighting, the soothing music, and the lack of visible clocks all conspire to create a timeless, insular environment where your critical judgment softens and your willingness to spend increases. It is a labyrinth designed not for a minotaur but for your wallet. Corporate architecture speaks a similar hierarchical language. Look at any major corporate headquarters and you will see a modern ziggurat. The most powerful executives invariably occupy the top floors, enjoying the best views and the most secluded spaces. This vertical arrangement is not merely practical, it is a powerful, non-verbal reinforcement of the company's power structure. An employee ascending to an executive suite for a meeting experiences a subtle but potent journey, a climb through layers of security and status that psychologically reinforces the authority of those at the summit. This modern corporate ladder is, in fact, a very real staircase. Our civic architecture continues this tradition of psychological influence. Government buildings from capital cities to local courthouses consistently employ imposing stone facades, grand staircases, and soaring columns. These features are not chosen solely for their aesthetic appeal. They are deliberate communications of authority, stability, and permanence. Walking up those broad, ceremonial steps to enter a courthouse physically prepares you for the solemnity of the proceedings inside, just as a visitor to an ancient temple was prepared by their ascent. Even our urban planning is informed by these age-old lessons. The placement of parks, the design of public squares, and the flow of traffic are all carefully considered to shape how we interact. A city might create a large, central green space to foster a sense of community identity, or design a network of pedestrian pathways to encourage certain social behaviors and discourage others. These decisions made by modern planners are applications of the same principles of environmental determinism that guided the architects of ancient Rome or Tenochtitlan. The language of power, written in stone and space, has simply been translated into glass and steel. Recognizing these enduring patterns is the first step toward understanding how our own minds are still being shaped every single day by the invisible hands of modern architect kings. From the overwhelming pyramids of Egypt to the celestial alignments of Maya cities, we have journeyed through the fascinating world of architect kings and their sophisticated use of design as psychological warfare. These rulers understood that architecture is not just about shelter or beauty. It is a powerful language that speaks directly to our subconscious, shaping how we think, feel, and perceive authority. The strategies we have explored, from monumental scale and controlled movement to symbolic geometry and sensory manipulation, reveal a profound understanding of human psychology that predates modern science by thousands of years. What is perhaps most remarkable is how these ancient techniques continue to influence us today, hidden in plain sight within our cities, institutions, and public spaces. The legacy of the architect kings reminds us to look critically at our built environment, to question why spaces make us feel certain ways, and to recognize that architecture always carries ideological messages. As you move through the world now, you will likely see these psychological principles at work everywhere, and understanding them gives you the power to see beyond the surface to the hidden narratives embedded in stone, steel, and glass. We would love to hear which architectural psychological strategy fascinated you most. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this exploration of history's hidden dimensions, subscribe for more journeys into the mysteries of our past.